After taking New Orleans, Union troops headed upriver to Baton Rouge. Governor Moore and the state legislature fled west and moved the state capital to Opelousas, ahead of the Union invasion. Baton Rouge fell to Admiral Farragut peacefully. A few weeks into the occupation of the city, however, 40 Confederate guerrillas launched a surprise attack on a group of Union sailors as they crossed the river in a rowboat. The sailors were just looking for a place to do their laundry. Admiral Farragut did not take the matter lightly. He ordered his fleet to open fire on Baton Rouge.
It was a heart-rending scene. Women searching for their babies along the road where they had been lost. Others sitting in the dust crying and wringing their hands. For by this time, we had not an idea but what Baton Rouge was in ashes or being plundered, and we had saved nothing.
Many who evacuated Baton Rouge did not return. Those who stayed behind awoke to the thunder of artillery again on August 5, 1862. This time, it was the Confederate Army that attacked the city. Once more, the citizenry fled amidst a murderous rain of gunfire. Major General John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, the former Vice President of the United States, led Confederate forces.
Breckinridge was going to attack the city from the east, and at the same time, a Confederate gunboat, the Arkansas, was to sail down from Vicksburg and disperse the Union fleet at Baton Rouge and bombard the Union forces from the riverside. But the Arkansas never arrived.
After making its way downriver, the warship's engines gave out 4 miles above Baton Rouge.
When the crew found that they couldn't restart the engines, they didn't want the Union fleet to capture it. So the Arkansas was set on fire and left adrift. And it exploded somewhere about where US 190 bridge is today.
The town, what there is left of it, is a deserted, desolate place. The streets are forsaken. The stores are closed. To the east of us are a large number of stacks of chimneys, which are all that is left of what 6 months ago were elegant residences.
After the Confederates withdrew, Union troops abandoned the city and returned to New Orleans, but not before looting what was left of Baton Rouge.
This place has been nearly completely sacked by the soldiery. Scarcely a single house has escaped, all the citizenry having fled. Even the officers' tents are filled with furniture from deserted houses.
I could hardly believe that Abraham Lincoln's officers had really come so low down as to steal in such a wholesale manner. Not a book remained in the parlor.
It was the policy of Butler, when he could, to leave the hard hand of war, as some historians have called it, on the people. And he thought initially that he could do this by destroying much, if not all, of Baton Rouge and making the people there feel the brunt of warfare.
Butler's troops wrecked or burned more than a third of the city's houses.
Butler just became too controversial. One of Lincoln's goals was to try to bring the southern states back into the Union as quickly as possible. But you have Butler there who has angered all the people, both loyal and rebel.
In December of 1862, Union General Nathaniel P. Banks sailed from New York with reinforcements. He arrived, unannounced, in New Orleans on a Sunday evening. General Banks had been sent to relieve the beast of his command. Fighting had spread across Louisiana like the onrush of summer brush fires. Battles were waged in the sugar-rich regions of Bayou Lafourche. Donaldsonville was bombarded and burned. General Banks led campaigns into the Bayou Teche region in the heart of Acadiana, ravaging the countryside. Blood was shed from Alexandria to the mouth of the Atchafalaya. But no matter how many battles they won, the Union still could not claim victory in Louisiana, for they still could not capture the Mississippi River.
By 1863, the Confederates only had 2 strongholds left on the Mississippi River, Vicksburg and Port Hudson. And as long as they could control those two spots, then they controlled the mouth of the Red River, for one. And in that corridor between Vicksburg and Port Hudson, the South was still able to shift supplies and men and mail orders. The two halves of the Confederacy were still linked as long as the South could maintain Port Hudson and Vicksburg.
Fighting raged in northeast Louisiana as the Union tried several times to open the river by taking Vicksburg, but they were driven back each time. Northern generals grew so desperate to seize the Mississippi that they even tried to change the river's course, straightening it to bypass Vicksburg altogether. Thousands of men were forced to dig miles of canals.
In doing this, they flooded northeast Louisiana. Union engineers estimated at one time that they had intentionally flooded 1,000 square miles of northeast Louisiana.
But the Mississippi stayed right where it was, firmly in Confederate hands. On May 27, 1863, General Banks ordered a full frontal assault on the rebel stronghold of Port Hudson. Among the vanguard were the 1st and 3rd Regiments of the Louisiana Native Guard, numbering more than 1,000 soldiers. 6 times they charged across open terrain through a blinding hail of enemy fire. At the front of their ranks was Captain Andre Caillou.
Caillou led his troops against an impregnable fortress there at Port Hudson. His name is often called up and referenced in terms of bravery of blacks, not only in the Civil War, but in other wars.
Louisiana Native Guard's assault at Port Hudson was heroic, but no more heroic than the others. The difference was it was the first time that black soldiers had been used on that scale, and it convinced Banks and began to convince other generals like Grant and Sherman that with proper training, black soldiers could be just as effective as the white soldiers.
Some called Andre Caillou the first black hero of the Civil War, but the battle at Port Hudson would make heroes of many men.
The heat of the day became oppressive, and it was most heartrending to hear the wounded begging to be moved into the shade, and we unable to do anything for them. Darkness finally threw a veil over the field, whereon lay hundreds of dead and dying.
Backed by Admiral Farragut's fleet of gunboats on the river, General Banks commanded a force of some 40,000 troops. The Confederates' fortress at Port Hudson was defended by less than 7,000, yet their lines held. The soldiers settled in for a long siege.
You can constantly bombard the defenders with artillery and rifle fire so that they can't rest, they can't move around during the daylight. You've got the heat, you've got insects, you've got all these factors that are just really constantly preying on the minds of these soldiers. There's no respite in siege warfare. It's constant bombardment, constant deprivation.
By the end of June, Union casualties exceeded 4,000.
Seeing the doctors with sleeves rolled up, splashed with blood, here a pile of booted legs, there a pile of arms, was more trying than the horrors of the battlefield.
The misery was so great that during lulls in fighting, the Confederate soldiers would sneak across the lines to bring canteens of water to the very men they'd been shooting.
The piteous cries of water, water, from hundreds of the enemy's wounded and the groans of the dying now touched with deepest sympathy those with whom they had but today been locked in deadly strife.
Despite Union charges and relentless pounding from Farragut's ships, the men at Port Hudson held off an army 6 times its size for 48 days, the longest siege in U.S. military history. But on July 7th, word reached them that 150 miles upriver, the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg had fallen. It was senseless to continue. Nearly starved, the rebels surrendered Port Hudson 2 days later. After trying to kill each other for 6 weeks, the soldiers now came out of their trenches laughing and weeping. Men in both blue and gray stood together on the battlefield, shook hands, and celebrated the end of the hellish siege.
There's a very human story, particularly during the siege, of the deprivation that the soldiers on both sides faced, the hardships that they had to go through, and really what it took for these men to remain loyal to the ideals that they had joined the armies to fight for, particularly the Confederate soldiers.
1 week later, the steamer Imperial sailed down the Mississippi and docked in New Orleans.
The Father of waters again flows unvexed to the sea.
Our cause is not dead, it is only sick. We are conquered but not subdued, and our independence will yet be recognized by the leading powers of the world. The Yankees are here on a visit.
Gettysburg was lost on July 3rd, Vicksburg on July 4th, Port Hudson on July 9th. The tide had turned against the South, but the Confederates clung stubbornly to their lost cause, and the war would drag on for another 2 years. With some 60% of the white males of Louisiana serving in the war, women and children were left to fend for themselves.
Annie, my dear, you will have to take the reins into your own hands. I hope by this time you have made arrangements for the coming crop. I'm very much afraid that you will not be able to make much this year. Never despair. Do your duty. With love, I remain your dearest husband until death.
As their modest farms and businesses collapsed behind them, many ordinary men in uniform began to question whose interests they were really serving.
There seems to be a very bad feeling between two classes of citizens here in Winfield. The non-slaveholding population thinks that the slaveholders are not doing their duty, and therefore should be made to do it.
Almost 3/4 of Louisiana's white families owned no slaves. They worked their small farms with